There's a perception that the people that have arrived here under their own means, our government calls them illegal immigrants. I don't like that term because a lot of them are claiming asylum and it's not illegal to claim asylum. They are perceived by some of the communities to be not coming in the right way, breaking the rules, queue jumping to get into some of the accommodation that's already difficult to get hold of for some of these communities anyway. Often politicians scapegoat that group of people as being the reason why you can't get a hospital appointment or, there's a shortage of jobs. After a while, that rhetoric begins to stick. And so what I think happened in the summer, all this negative rhetoric about immigrants and they're the blame for everything. And, they're all coming here to abuse our children or our daughters and they're to blame. And then it didn't take much to trigger it. It was false information about who attacked those poor little girls in Southport. But it was enough to trigger it.
Humans were a mixture of proper goodness and also brokenness and fear. And so a lot of it seems to me, is just what is being appealed to at any given moment by the media, by the government. It just feels like our fear is being used against us. How would you address some of those actual fears?
Well,
welcome to another episode of the Re-Enchanting podcast, the podcast brought to you by Seen and Unseen. I, as usual, am Belle Tindall.
And I, as usual, am Justin Brierley.
And we, together with a range of guests, we ponder this theme of re-enchantment. We look at our culture, our arguably disenchanted, materialistic culture, and we wonder whether it is craving re-enchantment and whether that can be found in the wonder and the mystery of the Christian story.
And joining us today is Krish Kandiah, or I should say Dr. Krish Kandiah, OBE, lots of letters
Lots
to
of
add.
things to add.
And Krish has done more things in the world of Christianity than I can count on all my fingers and toes. But currently is the founder of the Sanctuary Foundation, charity supporting refugees to find welcome work and worthwhile housing in the UK. But as I say, he's been at the forefront of many other initiatives, including fostering and adoption through the Home for Good charity, and also has written loads of books as well. I don't know where you get the time for all of this, Krish, but books on theology, activism, faith. And we wanted to bring you on, particularly this season, looking back at the summer, because of those riots and protests that sort of marred the summer months, purportedly over immigration. But we'll be kind of getting into the weeds of that. Ultimately asking how can we re-enchant the concept, I guess, of neighbour love in an increasingly divided world, looking at the riots, the refugees, the right wing, all of that kind of thing.
Yeah, you're very much one of those "it was only a matter of time" guests, Krish, I think, which is a
nice
great
to be
thing.
here.
Yeah.
I'm surprised it took so long.
I am too.
Well, right, it's season 5 and we haven't had Krish on yet.
This is the thing. If we hadn't got, there would be riots. The different kinds of riot if we didn't have you on.
That's right. That's good.
There's so much to talk about, and I'm so excited about all of it. But we, as an ode to our home, atop a library, we always start with a very specific question, and that is, what are you reading at the moment?
Well, I just started a book last night called Voodoo Histories. You might have read it. It's looking at how conspiracy theories begin and grow, and is there anything we can do to kind of stop it? I was particularly drawn to this after the US presidential debates and the whole question of the accusation that Haitian refugees are eating cats and dogs. And I thought, how could anyone possibly believe this? So I thought, let's read someone's analysis of how conspiracy theories develop.
Wow. Well, yes. I mean, it's kind of crazy that was the major talking point out of that whole debate, this crazy story that came out. But reading is actually something, another initiative I know that you've been involved in. You've kind of sort of started an initiative to get Christians reading books again, basically. Why do you think it's so important to actually read books?
I'm addicted to reading, so that's probably part of it. But as I looked at it, most leaders that I respected were very much committed to reading. There was a kind of appetite there, and I felt that we were losing it. I know I can get caught in my scroll of doom, and not reading anything meaty, and therefore I was kind of caught in a kind of, I don't know, soundbite culture.
Yeah.
And actually reading forces you to follow a train of thought. It's a form of listening, isn't it? Because you're allowing someone else to take you somewhere on a kind of narrative journey, or someone else to make an argument. And I think we're losing the capacity to listen well, and reading is a great way to kind of encourage that. There's a quote, isn't there, from Shadowlands, the movie that Anthony Hopkins plays C.S. Lewis. He says, we read to know that we're not alone. And I think there is something powerful about the encounter with another person when you read.
Yeah, brilliant.
This is one of the first ever kind of Christian books I read was Paradoxology.
Oh, wow.
I know, that's a pull from the past, isn't it? I went to a seminar of yours at a Christian festival,
No way.
and then I bought your book and I read it.
Come on.
And about 15 years later,
Here we are.
Am I aging
Well, you
us both
started with
too
a cracker.
far?
That's all I'm saying. If that was your first Christian,
Straight
you
in.
could have got some far worse titles than
Yeah, you're right.
Paradoxology.
That book
Straight
was
in with
my
Paradoxology.
therapy. That was me going, hey, there's loads of things I've never really got to the bottom of my faith. And maybe if I need to get to the bottom of them, other people might. And it's really encouraging, Belle, to hear that book was helpful.
I remember having you on The Unbelievable Show when I hosted that, talking about that with an atheist. And I was just amazed that you're this person who can, at one minute you're doing like activism for fostering an adoption. The next minute you're doing apologetics it's like you've worn so many hats over the years, haven't you, Krish?
Well, I think there is a link. I'm someone that's very committed to sharing the gospel in word and deed. I was converted through a friend at school who basically in a chemistry lab, while the teacher had nipped out for a quick smoke, leaving 30 teenage comprehensive school boys in charge of a lab, which was an incredibly dangerous thing to do. One of my mates stood up and he said, boys, I've got to tell you something. Last night I became a follower of Jesus.
No way.
And I'm going, mate, what are you doing? And so I went to see him afterwards and I said, look, you're new to this Christian thing. I've been doing it for a longer time than you, and it's not something you tell anyone about. It's private, right? And he says to me, Krish, if you knew the God that I met last night, you wouldn't be able to be quiet about it. And from that moment, I kind of had a flip switch go in my head that says Christianity is about public witness. And so for me, this journey of, fostering adoption, refugees, apologetics, it's one seamless line. Jesus said, let your light shine before men that they may see your good deeds and praise your Father in heaven. So the church is supposed to have a public witness of works. People are supposed to look at us and go, these guys are committed to compassion and kindness and mercy. I think we're also supposed to have a public witness of words where we explain the reason for the hope that we have that's driving us to show acts of mercy.
Hence the love of reading, hence kind of getting into the deep thoughts and theology of people, as well as obviously doing that really important stuff on the ground. It's amazing.
Can we talk? So there are so many things, as you say, so many hats we could talk to you about. Can we start with fostering and adoption? So Home for Good. I've done a little bit of work writing about Home for Good, and embarrassingly, I've never left a meeting with anyone who works for Home for Good without crying. And it's so embarrassing. I'm supposed to be like a professional writer, just turning up, and they undo me every single time. It's such a beautiful initiative. But can you tell us about the shape of your family in particular? And then we'll go from there.
So my wife and I, we have 6 children. 3 are through birth and 3 are through fostering and adoption. Our children were 6, 5 and 4 when we became foster parents. And that was really driven by my wife, who has a huge heart. And she said to me, I think we've got capacity to care for some more children. And I'm going, we've already got 3. Isn't that enough? And she's going, no, I think we can do some more. And a few things happened, one was some friends of ours in their 60s became foster parents for the first time to teenagers. And I thought, whoa, if they're willing to do that at that stage in life, we were in our 30s at the time, we should consider this. The second thing that happened was I became aware of some of the statistics, what happens if children age out of care without getting a loving family. And too often there's a conveyor belt that sends them into exploitation, criminalisation, or just being made homeless. And, all the issues that Christians often care about, trafficking and prison ministries and, the sex industry, things that we want to make a difference in. I'm going, well, we could start further upstream and actually help children find loving homes. And then the third thing, it shouldn't have been the third thing, it should have been the first thing, but every time I open the Bible, it seems to jump out at me that God really is concerned about the vulnerable, and particularly in the Old Testament, it's vulnerable children. So orphans, it describes them as that's just a child not living under the protection of a father. Widows, that's women that have don't have any social protections around them, because in a patriarchal society, if you don't have a man in your life, you're struggling. And the stranger, and that is the equivalent of refugees today. And then the New Testament, James says, religion that God our Father accepts as pure and blameless is to care for widows and orphans in their distress. I'm going, wait. That means if God were offsteading the church's worship, caring for the vulnerable is the number one thing. So all those things collided for me, and suddenly everything my wife was saying was making perfect sense, and we became foster parents then.
I think that's what so the first time I cried in a meeting with people from Home for Good, which is a fostering and adoption charity, just for anyone who's not aware of them yet. It was with an amazing lady, and she said to me, "Oh, it's okay. This happens a lot. Don't worry about it." Like, she was consoling me. This is how embarrassing this got. She was consoling me. She's like, "It's okay. This happens a lot." And then she said, I think it's because it's so close to the heart of God, we can't help but feel his anguish over it. She was like, "I think that might be what's happening to you."
Wow.
And I was like, well, that's just going to make me cry more. That doesn't actually help me. So, our next question is, how does your faith inform? But that's kind of obvious.
Well, we as a couple and then as a family, we see the scriptures as our North Star, right? That's the direction of where we want to live, in not just what we do on Sundays or what we do with 10% of our money or 10% of our time, but all of it. And so, when you're trying to figure out what is in the heart of God, as you say, these areas of hospitality, kindness, compassion to the most vulnerable, they are top of the list. So, of course, it's then going to alter the way that we structure our family, the things that we are passionate about politically, and to activate the church.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it feels like you and Miriam, your wife, have sort of very much a team, obviously.
Definitely.
You couldn't do what you do without, obviously, the both of you doing what you both do. And I was listening to you talk about your sort of early married life as well. You put yourself out there, because I think you started off life really working together in Albania, was it?
Yes.
So how did that kind of, some of those early experiences doing mission basically in Eastern Europe, what was that all about? And what did it how does it feed into, current day Krish, if you like?
Sure. So we were working with university students. Actually worked for the universities and colleges Christian Fellowship. That was our first job after leaving uni. So we were doing evangelism and mission and vocational training for people that were still undergraduates. And then Eastern Europe just opened up in the 90s, and I'd been visiting, because of a schools ministry I was involved with, been visiting places like Russia and Georgia just at the end of the kind of Cold War. And so I was convinced I was going to go be a missionary in Russia. That was definitely the place. I did Russian for chemists as part of my chemistry degree.
Oh, is this like to kind of get underneath the Iron Curtain kind of thing?
If anyone asked me, that was the plan, right? I was going to go and be a chemist by day, and at night time I was going to be this undercover missionary.
Sure.
And then I was really excited, but also it kind of upset a lot of my career plans that the Berlin Wall came down and you didn't really need a chemistry degree anymore.
All that chemistry.
All that chemistry
for the gospel,
nothing.
and
But
nothing
it's
to
all
come
good,
of it.
right? It was definitely a good move, and never mind about my chemistry degree. But I have an interest in science, so that was okay. And then I was really convicted that we shouldn't box God in just because I spoke a little bit of Russian and I'd read a lot of Russian literature and spent a lot of time in Moscow and St. Petersburg. I didn't feel we should say, okay, God, it has to be Russia. So we basically went to a mission agency and said, okay, here's our stuff. This is what we know. You send us wherever you want. And they said, okay, how about Ukraine or Siberia? And I'm going, okay, just let me get a map and check. I can't quite work out. Siberia sounds cold. I mean, wasn't there some kind of nuclear reaction in Ukraine? But yeah, sure. And then they changed their mind. They said Azerbaijan or Albanian. And then I thought they were having a joke. They were just flipping through what was
A's.
Operation Mobilizations. What was it? What was that book we used to pray?
Oh, yeah. I know
Operation
the one you mean.
World, was it?
Yes, that's one. Yeah.
And they're just flipping through it at random. And they said, no. Seriously, there's some really exciting stuff going on in Albania because it had been the most closed country in the world. It was illegal to have a moustache or a beard.
Wow.
And if you turned up at Tirana Airport, Renus, and with a beard, they would make you have a shave at the airport because it was illegal.
It was seen as a religious symbol.
Yeah, it was somehow linked to Islam.
Okay. Wow.
And you couldn't call your son John because that was a religious name. So, okay. So we ended up going to Albania and we loved it. It was incredible. The hospitality of the Albanian people. It was the poorest country in Europe at the time. It started some of our interest in vulnerable children because you'd walk through the centre of Tirana, Skanderbeg Square, and there'd be this little package on the floor and you'd get close to it and it was like a mummified baby, but it was alive but on its own, and people were just leaving cash next to it. So you go to pick up the baby and go, what's going on? And then suddenly its handler, often a relative, was round the corner and we just thought, this is wrong. Surely there's something we could do. So we started looking into, is adoption the right thing? Is some kind of child welfare space important for us, and it wasn't. We couldn't do anything, and so it wasn't until we came to the UK we were able to get involved in that space.
Amazing. I guess more recently you've been campaigning on behalf of and advocating for refugees and immigrants. I remember there seemed to be a real wave of openness and compassion about 2 years ago when the Ukraine war began, and suddenly a lot of people were opening up their doors. And there was a sort of just a period when it seemed like actually there's a kind of real welcome being extended here. It feels like a very different environment 2 years on, interestingly. So what do you think happened then and what's happened since when it comes to the national kind of conversation around immigration, refugees? And
I would take it even back a little bit further.
Okay.
Interestingly, while we were in Albania, the Kosovo crisis broke out. And we saw Albanians open their homes to Kosovans who were fleeing genocide, basically. And the Kosovans were blown away because it was the north of Albania and it was incredibly poor people opening their homes to Kosovans. They couldn't believe it. And then, we came to the UK, we got involved in helping Kosovans here because brown people that speak Albanian, that's really unusual. I used to meet people, suddenly start speaking Albanian to them, and they jump out their skin thinking they'd seen a ghost because people don't speak Albanian. And then, if you remember, I was running Home for Good back in the day, and there was David Cameron was the Prime Minister. And he was adamant that no Syrian refugees were coming to the UK, despite terrible things happening in Europe. And then there was that picture of Alan Kurdi washed up on Bodrum Beach,
and that picture just kind of flipped a switch, didn't it? Suddenly,
it did, and suddenly we're all in. And I got a tip off that David Cameron was going to specifically focus on unaccompanied asylum-seeking children. So I quickly phoned my board and go, look, I think there's something we need to do here. And he announced that we were going to receive, I think it was 20,000 unaccompanied asylum-seeking children from Syria over 5 years. And I'm going, that is brilliant, but there's already a shortage of foster carers in the country. So where is everyone going to go?
Sure.
So we launched an online campaign, basically a Facebook post and a web form, saying if you really want to get involved in helping, sign up and start the process to become a foster parent. And we thought we'd get 100 people, but we had 100 people in an hour.
Wow.
We launched it on Friday night at 9 o'clock at night. Terrible time to launch a campaign. By Saturday morning, it was 1,500 people. Sunday morning, it was 3,000 people. Monday morning, it's 8,000 people. That's enough for the Home Office to go, hey, can you come and help us? So I think what we saw with the Syria crisis, a little bit with the Afghans as well, and then with Ukraine, while it's in the news and people are watching it, they want to do something.
Yeah.
And if you give people a way to credibly respond immediately, they will. But if you don't, if you wait now, it's so hard to find anyone that will host. With Ukraine, we saw, well, our little charity, Sanctuary Foundation, we saw 29,000 people say they wanted to sponsor Ukrainian women and children. That was before there was a government scheme. And there's a moment when people are willing to do something, and then we get, what is it, compassion fatigue maybe.
Right.
We just think, oh, you know, I was up for it then, but I'm not now. Life has happened. So I think there's something about tapping into that empathy right in the moment when it's happening.
And then, as I say, you come to what happened in the summer, and then suddenly the front page news is people rioting, protesting over what they see as immigration and jobs being taken away, culture changed, everything else. I mean, is it just that these two things kind of both coexist, and is it more complicated than that?
Yeah, I think there are a few layers to this. So some people say what we did for the Ukrainians was racist. In fact, a friend of mine went round to dinner with another family, and they explained that they were going to be hosting a Ukrainian refugee, mother and son. And they said, oh, the people that were hosting them said, oh, no, we're not doing that because that's racist. You know, why are you only willing to help Ukrainian women? What about people from Eritrea and Sudan or whatever? And so my friend goes, well, oh, okay, well, what have you done for Eritreans and Sudanese people? Oh, nothing. But we still think it's racist to go and offer help to Ukrainians. So there is this, there are some perceptions around who's an acceptable immigrant and who isn't.
Right.
I got involved in helping the church to respond to about 200,000 Hong Kongers that arrived in the UK, mostly during lockdown. And the more right-wing parties didn't seem to oppose the arrival of people from Hong Kong.
Oh, right.
And Hong Kong people don't look like white Europeans, and yet they were acceptable. Some people say it's because there was some colonial history and therefore we felt we had some kind of responsibility. And then we did a good job, the church, responding to Hong Kongers. So the Home Office phoned me and say, we've got loads of Afghans coming. Could you help us? And actually the public responded pretty positively to helping Afghans. While it was in the news and you're seeing people cling onto the outside of aeroplanes or stuffed into the cargo holds of big planes, people were willing to help.
Yeah.
And again, there was some connection. You know, our military forces were in Afghanistan. These guys often were interpreters or security guards, or
it's very often things that humanize people. Essentially, isn't it? It's you suddenly see yourself or your daughter or whatever.
Exactly
in
right.
that situation.
And I think with Ukraine, the difference was that this was the first time the government had worked with civil society on a mass scale hosting program. They didn't offer it for Hong Kongers, didn't offer it for Afghans. It had been complicated for Afghans because they come from often larger families like mine, you know, 2 adults and 6 children. But women and children coming from a country that is perceived to be Europe, you know, close enough to our own culture. These kids, I remember there was one video of a little girl singing Let It Go from Frozen, and people going, that could be my daughter. And so there was that kind of empathetic bridge. And so people were willing to do it for that kind of brief period at the beginning when it was all happening. They did get involved. But I think what we're seeing in some of the animosity that's there, particularly in some of the communities we saw, you know, I suppose weaponized into the riots in the summer, for some of those communities, there's a perception that the people that have arrived here under their own means, our government calls them illegal immigrants. I don't like that term because a lot of them are claiming asylum, and it's not illegal to claim asylum. They are perceived by some of the communities to be not coming in the right way, breaking the rules, queue jumping to get into some of the accommodation that's already, you know, difficult to get hold of for some of these communities anyway. So, or often politicians scapegoat that group of people as being the reason why, you know, you can't get a hospital appointment, or, you know, there's a shortage of jobs, or there's a shortage of housing. And so after a while, that rhetoric begins to stick. And so what I think happened in the summer it's a little bit like what happened to me at school. Like one of my mates gave me a can of Coke and I could see he was smirking, and then some other kids were like sniggering as I was about to open it. And I opened the can of Coke and it exploded over me because they'd spent the last 20 minutes shaking it up.
Right.
And that's what happened this summer, is that all this negative rhetoric about immigrants, and they're the blame for everything. And, you know, they're all coming here to abuse our children or our daughters, and they're to blame. And then it didn't take much to trigger it. It was false information about who attacked those poor little girls in Southport, but it was enough to trigger it.
To light the flame, yeah.
The only other thing I think made a difference, my school was a pretty dodgy school in Brighton. If we had a supply teacher, then there was no control that supply teacher could have over the children, because we just didn't trust she had any authority. And you've got a new government.
Yeah.
And so you're not sure, like, let's push the boundaries. What can we get away with here?
Right.
So I think there was a kind of perfect storm
Interesting.
that was triggered.
Yeah. I think because we're all, as even just some of the things you've spoken about attest, we're a mixture of proper goodness and also brokenness. And we're a mixture of intense compassion and intense terror and fear. And so a lot of it seems to me is just what is being appealed to at any given moment by the media, by the government, so, you know, our compassion has like absolutely got up in flames. And then we've done something beautiful, like bring in all of these, like what you said, the 29,000 people willing to bring Ukrainian refugees in. And it just feels like people's terror and people's fear was really targeted and got at with lies and things. I live in Bristol, which was one of the cities where we had one of these big riots, and it was actually my birthday. And so I was out in the city centre enjoying my birthday, and on the way home late at night, the riot had died down, and I was at a bus stop with my boyfriend, and someone in a St. George's like cap came over, and he had like his flag around him, and he had a big t-shirt on, and he was just really loudly like saying everything, you know, that you'd expect him to say. And I'm not great. So I was very obviously like, I wanted him to see me roll my eyes at him. And I was kind of like countering his comments with my own. I was being very snide. And my partner, he went up and spoke to him. And I was really angry. Wow. I was like, what? Really angry. And so it wasn't until the next day that I spoke to Sam. I was like, why did you speak to him? And Sam said, I spoke to him and he was just really scared. He was really scared. And someone had told him that there was a solution, and the solution was this. So it just feels like our fear is being used against us in many ways. Do you sense that as well?
Totally. It's how it works, isn't it? That if you're trying to get power, you'll play sadly on people's insecurities in order to try and get that power. We've seen that so many times through history. This kind of shift towards the extreme end of the right wing isn't just happening here. It's happening in lots of places around the world, around Europe. You've got all sorts of economic pressures, and so give people a scapegoat, and people are willing to take it. And sometimes, again, it's playing on good intentions, but weaponizing them. So who doesn't want to keep their family safe?
Exactly.
Who doesn't want to make sure children are going to be okay? Yeah. Who doesn't want to make sure that people get jobs and there's law and order, right? So those are good instincts, but they can play on them and weaponize them, and then suddenly you're doing something you didn't expect to be doing. I was worried that a lot of the young people that were being radicalized by this, you know, anti-immigrant sentiment, actually could be quite impressionable, vulnerable, and suddenly they've been, you know, co-opted into someone else's scheme. And so that's why I think the punishment that's being meted out, it is appropriate that we punish people that broke the law and endanger people's lives, but it's often the kind of foot soldiers that have been charged rather than the influences that instigated that. And I think they have more responsibility, and we need to go after that.
Absolutely. Which is exactly what was like a real life example at the guy I met at the bus stop. In which case, where my instinct was just to meet fire with fire and get very angry, how would you address some of those actual fears and meet people where they actually are, which, like you say, is kind of is fearful, and those good intentions that have been twisted. I don't how would you get to those places? How would you address those concerns and those fears?
Well, it's one of the reasons I'm reading the book I'm reading at the moment. I think, how do you talk someone out of a conspiracy theory that they have been kind of captured by. And our politics and our media doesn't do a great job at that. So, how often do you hear an interview on the radio between a journalist and a politician, and the politician go, you know what, that's a really good point. I haven't thought of that before. I'm going to go away and do something about it. Or the journalist it hardly ever happens because we're in this kind of gotcha kind of anger sells media attention, and therefore the 30-second clip on X or Instagram that shows a politician not knowing the numbers or looking stupid just gets more hits than the politician going, I need to go away and think about that. I need to change my mind. Oh, you can't change your mind. Change your mind would be ridiculous, right? That's a U-turn. So we've created a really bizarre media environment. I try to go on to media channels that I don't agree with in order to try and be a reasonable, gracious presence.
I've noticed you do that. That's very bold. Well, it's great.
I try. I had the best example the other night. I went on an unnamed media channel, and I'm normally considered the lefty liberal, which seems mad to most people with but anyway, I'm the lefty liberal in this environment. They put someone on, and the debate was, why are English heritage letting refugees go for free? That's just so terrible. What a terrible idea that is. and the guy that went against me, he starts off, he goes, why are we letting these refugees go for free? They shouldn't even be here in the first place. We should be letting veterans go for free. So I'm thinking, how can I find some common ground? I'm going, well, actually, veterans going for free, that's a really good idea. I think we should do that. I definitely think we should welcome veterans to go free because they have served our country. But people who have fled war and terror, who have been vetted by our Home Office as being genuine refugees, well, actually helping them know a little bit about British culture is probably good. It will help integration. A lot of people think that would be quite important. And the moderator, for the first time, and I must have been on this show like 50 times, he goes, you're right. Good point. I thought, yes, Lord, it's working. So I think we've got to find a way to build bridges, to find that common ground, and not to. I mean, I'm with you. If I was on in Bristol when you were, I would have been getting angry, and what your boyfriend did, of trying to establish genuine communication. I think that is the way that we need to go forward, but it's hard, and sadly, Christians often get caught up in the culture war, and we are adding fire to the flame rather than being peacemakers.
I am just breaking into today's conversation to remind you that Re-Enchanting is brought to you by Seen and Unseen. Seen and Unseen is a magazine website with hundreds of articles by hundreds of contributors, all written to give you a Christian perspective on just about everything. That's culture, trends, current affairs. There are articles on it all, and you can find all of it at cenunseen.com. But for now, back to today's conversation.
Some of the talking points that were coming from the more kind of conservative, anti-woke, right-wing kind of commentators on this was that, well, none of them were endorsing the violence, as it were. Well, some probably were, but most that I sort of saw commenting on it weren't. But they were saying things like, but this was inevitable. This was going to happen because of the policies that have allowed what they see as unfettered almost immigration. And some people were saying, look, we're not against immigration per se. Some immigration has been good for this country. The Windrush generation, African Caribbean immigrants who have given so much to our country. But I think a lot of them were saying, but there's a different kind of immigration where, especially I think seeing lots of people from primarily Islamic countries coming and kind of, in their view, creating a kind of ghettoized culture where actually it becomes a sort of mini state of its own and kind of ramps up tensions between them and the rest of the community. And a lot of people point to things like, the Rotherham gangs and so on, and accusations of a kind of two-tier, policing and sort of a kind of politically correct culture, not allowing people to express their fears and concerns and everything. And that kind of is what actually contributes to eventually it boils over, because you're not taking this stuff seriously, that this kind of pluralism project isn't working out in every case. So what do you say just to those? Because those are some of the key kind of points that float around this debate in terms of people who kind of have their concerns about immigration?
So I think it's often, how do I want to describe this? So with the ghettoization conversation, so our friends or our newcomers from other countries unwilling to integrate, I always think that is somehow a reflection on us, right? So if someone comes to my house, I have responsibility as the host to go the extra mile, right? They're the guest, I'm the host. That's the kind of power imbalance, isn't it? I'm the one that knows how things work in my house. I'm the one that has access to stuff that my guest doesn't. So I've got to go the extra mile. So if there are people that have felt unwelcomed in our country and therefore they've ended up living separately to everybody else, that's as much our fault as theirs. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So, I mean, it is true. I think there is a rising degree of Islamophobia in our country. Mm-hmm. I'm a Christian, right? I'm clear about that. I think the Bible's clear that Jesus is the only saviour, the only mediator. I don't agree with the theology of Islam. But I think the Bible also teaches me that I need to treat everybody as a neighbour, and I've got to show them love and kindness and respect. But when it comes to Islam, there are so many negative prejudices that exist out there. I used to do an experiment with social workers. I've done it with civil servants as well. And I used Post-it notes because I'm old school. And I'd give out, like, everybody gets 9 Post-it notes, 3 pink ones, 3 blue ones, 3 yellow ones. On the pink Post-it note, this is completely anonymous. I don't know who you are. You just tell me the truth. There are no wrong and right answers. I want you to write on those 3 Post-it notes, what's the first word that comes into your mind when you hear the word Muslim? And they write down a word. I said, make it an adjective if you can. That's a describing word. And then I'll collect them in. And then we do the same for Christian. And then we collect them in. And then we do the same for atheist. And then I collect them in. And then the old school Top Gear used to have something called a cool wall on it. And I don't endorse all of the things that have happened on Top Gear, but that was a cool bit of
those caveats aside. Yes.
I like. And I'd read out what came in through the Post-it notes.
Yeah.
And I'd ask the audience to tell me where on the, negative, positive, ambivalent, right? You tell me where it was. And so for the Christians, they'd go, do-gooders. I said, do-gooder, is that a positive word or a negative? No, that's a negative word, isn't it? That's someone who's naive and trying to do good but not really doing good. A Bible basher, okay, that'll be a negative word. Community, a good word, right? So Bible, ambivalent. So we'd map it out, and it would probably be maybe, 60% negative and maybe 30% positive and then 10% ambivalent. And then I'd read out the Muslim ones. Bear in mind, these were social workers or civil servants. It would be suicide bomber, jihadi, wife beater, extremist. And it would be 80% negative words coming from seemingly well-educated civil servants and social workers. And then we do atheists. And atheist was like intelligent, rational, compassionate.
Our only hope.
And I go, wait, that's like 80% positive and 20% negative. Like, what? And then I'd ask the room, I'd say, hey, well, what do you make of this? I said, well, that's just the way it is. I said, okay, how about if I only told you one thing about the person? You've built this picture of them, right? If I told you that this person was black, and we had 80% negative, what would you call? Oh, that would be called racism. How about if I told you they were gay and we had 80%? Oh, that would be homophobia. What do you call it if I just told you their religion and you've got 80% negative? Oh, we don't have a word for that. So there are these fears out there right through our culture about Islam. And a lot of it is people just haven't spent any time with people from an Islamic background. And just like you can find within the Christian world people that have crazy extreme views, like the Ku Klux Klan, right? They do not represent mainstream Orthodox Christianity. Well, neither do ISIS or the Taliban represent mainstream Islam. Now, it doesn't mean I agree with Islam, but it means you just shouldn't have these fear-based prejudices. We need to engage with people as people. And I think Christians are as much a part of that absolute fear and terror of Islam as the rest of the culture. And I think we've got to get over that to say, no, this is another person made in the image of God. We disagree theologically, but we can agree. I, as a Christian, have a moral responsibility to show love and kindness and compassion to that person.
Absolutely. So good. Can we talk about the far right, Krish?
Oh, yeah. Come on.
Another
Bring it on.
small topic to just
Another heavy.
get our teeth
And
into.
we'll go into specific things, but just first off, there seems to be a rise in populist far right party politics across Europe. I just wonder what thoughts you have on that from your, point of view, where you've done so much. And
so I am concerned about it. And let me start positively. Like, right and left are not the only ways that we could understand the politics of our day.
yeah.
But let's use it because you brought it up. So I think right-leaning politics have some really positive elements to it, right? So individual responsibility. As a Christian, do I believe we have individual responsibility? Yes, I do.
Yeah.
Law and order, is that an important part of my Christian faith? Yes, it is. The family, is that important? Yes, it is. Okay. Small state, big state. I could see arguments both sides for that. So I have a lot of my Christian beliefs that overlap with things that might be described as right wing. But some people, someone put it to me this day, they've caught the bus towards right wing politics and they didn't get off at the reasonable moderate stop. They just kept on the bus and they've stayed on the bus so far that now it feels that we've developed not just a love of nation, which is an important part of the right, but somehow some kind of nationalistic superiority that says, actually, I believe it's good to love the country that you're in. It's part of being a neighbour, isn't it? That we recognise the value of our culture. But we move into another territory when we say, actually, my country's better than others. I look down on you because you're not the same culture as me. I need to protect my country from the dilution of other cultures coming in here. Now we've crossed, haven't we? Not into a love of nation, into some form of xenophobia and scapegoating. And again, a lot of the church sometimes gets on the bus and just doesn't get off at the right stop. They just keep on going. Some of the language used around faith, family, and flag, actually, if you look back in history, they have been weaponized in the past, haven't they? They've been weaponized in the past such that some pretty awful things have been done. And I know there's some rule that we're not supposed to bring up the Nazis too early in a conversation, but it does worry me. I've been reading Bonhoeffer again. And the confessing church in Germany was only 20% of the church. Well, what were the other 80% doing? They had been weaponized by definitely the extreme far right into hating Jews, into hating disabled people. All other races were somehow lesser. And Christianity provided the engine to make that possible. That's really frightening. It's not just happened in the Nazis, it's happened in apartheid South Africa. So we know that's possible. Now, is it possible in the other direction too? Yes, it is. There are things on the left that I think are really appropriately biblical. So community, responsibility, recognizing that we have to kind of look out for one another. If the right is about conserving the past, and there's definitely a good, strong Christian commitment to that. The left is often more about progress and adaptation and working out what things mean in a new context. Should Christians care about that? Yeah, I think we should. I think those are good things. Collective responsibility, definitely good. But it's possible to stay on the bus too long in the opposite direction and suddenly we're giving up on things that really matter to our faith. What I find about people on the right, Christians on the right, is that they are so terrified of the left that they're not noticing how far they're shifting away to the extreme right. And I've been in lots of rooms where people tell me the biggest threat to the world right now is Marxism or woke ideology. And I'm going, well, I can see, if you push it too far, you could. But actually, there's some really important points that the whole movement's making about race and gender and whether everybody feel included. We don't have to go to the extreme.
But the problem almost for me is that that's the way our social media now acts. So it constantly amplifies the extremes.
It does.
And kind of makes you forget that there's a sort of slightly exhausted middle a lot of the time.
Yeah.
But it also kind of sends people off to those extremes because those are the voices they're hearing. And I mean, how much is that responsible for the fact we are seeing the rise of more kind of far right kind of movements in Europe, places where maybe you never expected them to see, like in Germany and places like that? Suddenly something that has a whiff of the Nazis is suddenly kind of coming up again, you know.
I've only got one sociologist, so if I tell you he's my favourite sociologist, it's probably a bit of an overstatement. There's a guy called Zygmunt Bauman, and he talks about in a storm, everybody looks for a safe haven. And I think we retreat into the tribes when things are uncertain. And so I feel like that's what's happening. Like as so many complicated things are happening in our world right now, whether that's geopolitically, whether it's the, you know, am I going to have a job or is AI going to take my job, and cost of living and all that sort of stuff. You give me a simple answer, like who's to blame and who's going to look after me. I think it drives us into these tribes, and the idea that you might want to bridge build across those tribes and find something good in the enemy, that's the bit that's reducing.
So, as you know, Krish, I wrote a book about a year ago, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, and podcast series as well, and talking about the interesting new conversation on God happening in a lot of public squares, and interesting individuals talking more sympathetically about God than the new atheists did, and even some of them coming to faith, it would appear, as well. And but I know that you, and I've bumped into this from a lot of people, as I've sort of talked about this thesis, have a concern that, well, a lot of these characters are kind of basically on the right wing. So is this just a sort of a right wing kind of movement? And I'm thinking of people like, say, Jordan Peterson, who, you know, drawing big crowds, pointing young men towards the Bible, but kind of very much on the anti-woke, conservative kind of culture war-y kind of side of the platform. And there are many others I could add to that, you know, Douglas Murray, you know, again, sort of talking very sympathetically about Christian values, but, you know, obviously veering to the right. Ironhurst Yali, well-known convert now. But again, very much kind of read anything she writes on immigration or anything like that, you'll kind of be familiar with that stuff. So what's your thoughts on firstly, this new interest in talking about God and Christianity, and what are your concerns?
So I think that it's really healthy for a society to have left and right, that Christians can veer towards one or the other, and that's good, right? Because if I go too far left, someone on the right might be able to ask me important questions. It's why I believe in intergenerational and intercultural dialogue. Like my friends from, I was with a friend recently from Bethlehem asking me important questions about what's going on with Israel and Gaza, and his lived experience is helping me see my blind spots. Right. So we need that, right? We need the diversity of political and geopolitical persuasions. But I am worried that some of the rebirth or renaissance of Christianity does seem to play into some of the fears people have. So I've heard Richard Dawkins say, if it's a choice between Team Jesus or Team Muhammad, I'm Team Jesus. And you go, okay, you don't actually believe any of the core teachings of our faith, right? So does God exist? No. Did Jesus... I don't even know that. I don't think he thinks Jesus existed. Definitely the resurrection didn't take place. So core biblical teachings. But culturally, he's more at home in a Christian world where there are cathedrals and choral evensong. And when Christianity is chosen in order to fight off the apparent barbarian hordes of Islam, then I'm nervous. And then I'm going, actually, you seem to have missed the core teaching of the Christian faith, which is you love your neighbor and you love your enemy. And so if you're using Christianity to kind of weaponize some form of nationalistic pride, I think you've abused the faith. You're like the guy who tries to commandeer a vehicle. You know, I always wanted to do that. You know, you put out your badge, FBI, stop this vehicle. I'm going to get in it and use it. You've chucked the driver out and you're now using it for your own purposes. I fear that some of the interest in this renaissance in Christianity is like that. Not all of it, for sure. I mean, I was literally reading a bit in The Guardian last night where John Harris is still talking.
I read the article this morning. Yeah.
And you go, wait, he knows he's missing something, right? There is an aching, and I think that's an aching for God, for sure. Again, when I read John Harris's piece, he's feeling uncertain in the world, and definitely Christianity can offer a help to that. But again, if that's all it is, just I need something to make me feel better in the world, you're using Christianity in the way that Marx would have called it a crutch, right? Or an opiate. So either side can get this wrong and try to misuse Christianity for our own purposes. The other thing that came out recently, Theos did a survey, or they analysed census data, to be more exact, about which group of people are most likely to oppose immigration or helping asylum seekers. And it was non-attending Anglicans. So cultural Christians.
Right.
Right? And I'm going, at one point I should be really surprised at that, because my life was changed because the scriptures tell me that God cares about the widow, the orphan, and the stranger. And that's the litmus test of whether you're in the kingdom or not. So how can so many people who call themselves, self-identify as Christians, be so far away from the core teaching of our faith? But then you look back to the Bible, and Jesus's big fight was actually not with atheists and pagans. It was people that had weaponized the Jewish faith for some kind of nationalism that feared the stranger, it feared sinners. And you go, okay, that Pharisaical approach to religion was what Jesus had the biggest problem with. And so I guess there's a bit of work we need to do to put our own house in order, to say to the church or anyone that claims Christian faith, can we help you see what you might have missed in the core of our faith?
Let me just sort of play devil's advocate, for want of a better phrase,
Go for it.
here though, which is, I was fascinated to see Richard Dawkins, the cultural Christian, as it would appear, opposite Ironhurst Yali in a kind of debate they had, discussion for Unheard in New York. And he was kind of somewhat mystified by her turn to Christianity, as much as he kind of appreciates some of the cultural value of it. And he said, why have you done this, Ayan? And she basically said, I've chosen kind of to become a Christian because it's the best story I can think of for pushing back against the other stories that are dominating now our culture. So she was talking about sort of the woke progressive left that she's concerned about, but also Islam as well. And, Russia, China, lots of these sort of hegemonic powers. And she said, the problem is that your secular humanism is such a sort of shallow, non-existent story. It's not going to help anyone. It's going to completely cave to all these other things. And I've discovered there's this story, this Christian story, that I've embraced and that can actually give people a reason for going out and kind of offering a different story. Now, she does that obviously in quite a political way.
Yeah.
Okay. But just to try and give the best sort of case for where some of these folks are coming from, I think they're really concerned that other stories are starting to dominate our culture. And they've realized that a lot of the things they value turns out come from the Christian story. And so they want to preserve that, as you say. That's the kind of the right-wing sort of thing, is like it's the conserving of something. But the only way they see they can do that is by to some extent pushing against an Islamic kind of view of reality. If they see that is being imposed in some way, they're going to say no to that, or a kind of very kind of progressive agenda or whatever it might be. And so is there anything wrong with wanting to preserve Christian culture per se, I suppose?
Let me do the positive thing. I want to encourage anybody that's taking positive steps towards Christianity, because I believe that the gospel is literally for everybody, and there are different ways that we journey towards it. What was it that helped C.S. Lewis? It was exploring ancient literature and stories, wasn't it? That the Christian story made sense of all the other stories that he loved. So that journey worked for him. And I want to commend that. I think that is fantastic. I guess where I get nervous is when, go back to this bus metaphor, right? If they're coming in from somewhere else, have they actually got to the Christian bus stop yet? Or are they just moving in the right direction? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Or worse would be they've got on a bus, they think it's the Christian faith, and they're commandeering commandeering it for their own purposes. That's happened so many times in the past, like the Salem witch trials, right? That was Christians persecuting women, or the Crusades. That was Christianity being weaponized to fight against Muslims. And as we mentioned, Nazi Germany. So there are so many ways that, because religion has such a persuasive power over people's lives, if you can commandeer it, you can have so much impact. So we've always got to watch that. That's why Jesus was so critical of false teachers. He was so critical of people that would abuse their power in order to get what they want. That's why he rescinded it. He talks about, you've seen how the secular people lord it over you, but I tell you, the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and give his life as a ransom for many. So I think everywhere we're trying to be discerning, aren't we? Like, encourage the good. If people are making the right moves towards Christianity, let's encourage them in, but let's make sure they get to the whole of it and not just the kind of facade of it. And then my Albanian friends used to tell me, eat the fish and leave the bones. Let's develop some sort of discernment. And the key way we do that is by helping people into a fully formed biblical literacy. I think we can't just let people have a banner or a slogan or a catchphrase that somehow is Christian. We need to say, okay, let's help you see how this fits into the grand sweep of what the Bible's actually teaching. And as we study the Bible, you might spot things that I've been getting wrong. I'm open for that. And maybe as someone who's schooled in this tradition, I might be able to help you further understand it. So I think we just got to push people towards greater discipleship and discernment.
I suppose my big concern is I'm tracking with everything you're saying, Krish. My concern is that sometimes you'll miss something that is important that they're saying because you don't like their politics or something like that. And that for me is the danger. It's that whole thing, like you said to the guy at the bus stop, Belle, it's like sometimes it is important to just hear what someone has to say and kind of try and see the world from their perspective.
That's right.
Even though we've all got our blind spots and we're all kind of,
And I think that's where genuine face-to-face conversation matters. So, Twitter and X and social media platforms, you think you've heard a person, but actually you haven't heard their whole argument. You've heard either the worst bits from the opposition or the best bits from their kind of fans. And so sitting down, listening, reading their books, as we've been talking about at the beginning, where they flesh out their argument in its fullness. I think we go back to that. We believe in truth and humility. And that means I believe there's truth. I believe there's a right way of reading scripture, but I don't think I've always got it completely right. And so spending time with people that are very different politically, socially, culturally, is actually really healthy for me. So I think those are probably the big things that we need to go. I used to study a missiologist called David Bosch. He talks about bold humility, and I quite like that. Like, I am absolutely convinced that Christianity is true and the scriptures are inspired. I'm bold about that, but I'm humble about my interpretation, and therefore sitting down, going on these crazy news channels with views I don't agree. Actually, I need to have the humility to say, look, sometimes the other side are going to get things right.
There's a real, it strikes me that there's a real security in that. And there's a real confidence in you to be able to do that. And actually it's less confident of someone like me to not be able to have that proper conversation with the guy at the bus stop. And I just wonder if all of this, and one of our questions we wanted to put to you was, how do Christians break out of the left-right binary that actually, as you say, is not that truthful? It's too shallow to hold and contain us. And I just wonder, with the Re-Enchanting podcast, and it just strikes me as you're speaking that it's a symptom of a disenchanted world, that we've lost this humility to think, I might not know it all. Like, everything that's true about this person, I might not already know, and I might not be able to know just from seeing their interview on whatever. It's quite a disenchanted way of living, isn't it? Which is quite interesting, seeing as we're like the Re-Enchanting podcast. It's, that's such a roomier way to live. But do you have any other tips on how we can kind of transcend this? You versus me, good versus bad.
I talk about the power of proximity. I'll give you a negative example, hopefully lead to a positive one. So I gave a talk recently about welcoming refugees, hospitality, and someone came up to me at the end and said, "Oh, don't don't agree. You know, I think all these guys are coming here to sponge off the state, and we should have the Rwanda program because then they won't want to come here in the first place. I said, oh, okay. Well, what do you do? He said, oh, I help people that have got themselves into debt. I go, that's interesting. Some people have prejudices about people that have got themselves into debt. They think, why would you bother helping them? It's their own fault. You know, if they don't have so many lattes and Netflix and gym memberships, then they'd be able to pay for their, you know, all their bills. And I said, but I bet you've spent time with people that are struggling with debt, and you know those stereotypes aren't true. And there are all sorts of reasons that lead to people getting into really difficult situations with their money. I just think we need to show the same willingness to listen to refugees and asylum seekers. So let's spend some time. So I do think if you spend time with the people that you think are the big problem, either way, your mind will be changed, right? You will find out that there's another human being at the other end of this Twitter conversation, or there's another human being at the other end of this political debate. And as you do that, you can probably find some common ground. You humanize the other person, and then you realize I can't speak like that about these people. I've got to find another way of understanding.
Have you got any examples you could share of where you've seen that happen in real life, you know, where, you know, it's not like just the shadow boxing on X or whatever with the...
I'll give you a good one. So there is a preparatory school close to where we live, and the chair of the board was a very well-to-do gentleman, and he agreed to host a Ukrainian refugee. And Inji came into his house, and he was really upset that getting her a visa took 5 weeks. And so he was on his phone to the MP saying, look, 5 weeks for a visa, this is completely terrible. I didn't want to tell him that 5 weeks for a visa is incredibly quick, right? If you're trying to get a visa, even from a Commonwealth country, it could take you 3 to 6 months. 5 weeks is amazing. Anyway, through him and others, they got the visa approval process for Ukrainian refugees down to 48 hours, right?
Wow.
Pester power. It was amazing. Anyway, so she comes to live in his house, and then in order to claim benefits, she has to go to the job centre. And he's never been to a job centre in his life, right? So he has to kind of Google where the job centre is, like a half an hour drive away. He drives her there. Horrible place. And he's upset now. Like, this job centre is ridiculous. Why do you have to go there every week? So he's on the phone to the MP. He's saying, hey, our job centre system isn't working. This is ridiculous. Like, why would they need to go? Why aren't they just learning English instead? And so he's advocating for this. And then finally, it helps a refugee to have the dignity of their own front door. A soft landing into hosting is great, but at some stage you need somewhere where you can live. He did not realise that trying to find social housing is so difficult. And so he came with me as a lifelong Tory voter. He came with me with a petition from 20,000 other hosts to Downing Street saying, look, we need to sort out social housing. What had made the difference for him? It was someone who'd been a stranger, but now was a part of his family, was suffering all the things that he thought only undeserving people suffered. But now he'd come close to that. This was not just a someone else's problem. This affected someone that he knew and loved. And I've seen the same kind of approach happen when people have fostered or adopted children. Suddenly they become aware of things they didn't know before. Why is it so difficult to get support for children with special educational needs and disabilities? The systems aren't working, but you're drawing people from outside of the system into a system, and suddenly they see things differently. So I think proximity makes the biggest difference.
I mean, given that it is still such a political football, immigration, do you feel like we're getting anywhere? Are we, I guess, you know, everything you've said in terms of the Christian response about hospitality, neighbour love and everything doesn't necessarily negate that you need an immigration system that works.
For sure.
And I think that's where a lot of people's concerns are. We just have a system that's broken in all kinds of ways and failing people and creating unsafe situations and everything else. I mean, do you have any ideas of what would help right now in terms of...
I think that's another thing that happens when we have an oppositional approach to immigration. People think they've heard the other side's argument, but actually they've probably only heard a straw man version of the other person's argument. So I phoned into the Nicky Campbell show this morning because he was talking about this. And
You're unstoppable. You're like, I can imagine which channel you were on that you were the other day, but like even when you're not being invited on, you're phoning in to give your opinions.
I think they were desperate, so they took me on. I think they liked an Asian-sounding voice because they didn't have many of them on the call. And so people assume when it comes to immigration that you're either 100% closed or 100% open. And they label, like, if you're positive about immigration, you just want open borders, right? And I'm going, not fair. I think we should have an approach to immigration that takes into consideration control and compassion. Mm-hmm. And at the moment, we haven't figured out quite how to do that. My metaphor for this is our family, right? So we have 6 children that live at home, and at the end of the day, I lock the front door. Okay, and I'm really nerdy about these, even though some of my children are older. I want to know who's in the house. You know, I don't sleep until everyone's home and I know where they are, right? And I lock the door. But if I got a call from social services, then I unlock the door and another child can come in. Mm-hmm. Now, I don't believe in open borders. I don't think we should have everybody that's in the world that is seeking asylum needs to come to the UK. I think we need to take a fair number, but we don't have to take everybody. Just because in my house, if I took 1,000 children to come and live in my house, my family loses its structural integrity, right? I have no ability to care for everybody. Everyone suffers as a result. So I want to see a compassionate and a controlled border that says, okay, we will assess you. We have a fast and fair system that if you claim asylum, we'll give you a fair run. You know, we'll see, are you really fleeing war and terror? Or are there other reasons that you want to be here? Because we'll say no to you if the reasons aren't valid, and we'll say yes to you if the reasons are valid. And we'll decide, you know, not in a polemical way, but in a humanitarian way, how many people you think normally, unless there's a major crisis, we can care for. So I do think that is possible. But sadly, that conversation isn't happening. I think what's happened is most of the kind of political discussion has moved pretty right. And so people are very nervous about immigration. Both Labour and Conservatives are saying immigration is too high. We've got to figure a way to solve the problem of immigration, rather than seeing all the benefits that immigration brings and then work out what is a controlled and compassionate approach.
We could go on and on and on, Krish. I wish we could. We need like a mini series, like a spin-off series, Re-Enchanting with Krish Kandiah. But for now, very sadly, I guess we should sort of wrap it up.
Yeah. Thank you for re-enchanting us. And just for, I love all the stories that you have there in your head, Krish, and they just come spilling out and it's wonderful. Appreciate the fact as well that you're doing the common ground thing, because I think that's the missing ingredient so often, is actually just talking to people sometimes, and suddenly some of those barriers that we've erected in our minds break down. So keep doing that.
I'm grateful for your podcast.
Keep going on the you know. And speaking of podcasts, actually, we try to hopefully not be able to be called left or right on this podcast. That's our kind of dream, is that we somehow transcend those categories. I'm not sure if we
I'm not sure if the
time,
comments on YouTube get that that's our aim, but
but I feel like we've done it with you, Krish. You weren't too much of a lefty liberal on this one, so
good.
It's great to have you on, though. Seriously,
thanks for having me.
And thank you. We'll make sure there's a link for some of the things we've talked about on the show today for people who want to go and find out more. But for now, thank you very much.
Yeah, and there is more about Re-Enchanting podcast on Seen and Unseen, along with lots of other content, including pieces written by Krish Kandiah himself. So you can find those on cenunseen.com, and you can help future conversations like this happen at cenunseen.com/give. But yes, for now, we will see you next time.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.